Hello, hello, Saggy Joe. Is this recording now? Oh yeah, I think it is. Yeah, hi, Saggy Joe here. So I came across this really interesting lecture on the neurobiology of transsexuality. I'll just do a short clip of what the professor here says about transsexuality, and then kind of expand from there.
Have been a handful of studies, and they show essentially the same thing. Really, really interesting. Another region of the brain that shows a sex difference in its average size. Don't even worry about the name of this. It's called the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis. It's where the amygdala begins to send its projection into the hypothalamus. Another one of those gender differences.
The amygdala is essentially like kind of like the Google of sort. No, not Google. The amygdala, it processes a lot of the information and it passes through to the rest of the brain. As the amygdala is very important in that, if I remember correctly. I will fact check myself a little later, but that's something to keep in mind because I'm just gonna keep continuing this.
Difference is there's one type of neuron in there with a certain type of neurotransmitter where very, very reliably it is about twice the size in males than in females. Sufficiently so that even in human brains you could pretty confidently determine the sex of somebody by seeing the number of these neurons. You'll see I'm not even saying the name of the neurotransmitter, it's irrelevant. It's just another one of those differences, a dimorphism in a region of the brain, a really, really reliable one. And this was a study done by some superb neuroanatomists looking at transsexuals. And what they showed was very interesting, which
So I want to keep this. Uh, I want to keep this idea very important. There aren't many sex differences between a male and female, but there are some, and those some make a huge difference in how a lot of like we see the sex difference. But you have to understand these are all biological differences, and this region in the brain that he's talking about has nothing to do with the intellectual competence of said person. No matter what he says moving forward, it's something to keep in mind. There's very little difference in sex differences, and but then the differences that do exist are very very prominent. It's very very obvious that a woman has a pair of like honkers and doesn't have a little soldier standing up at 9 o'clock sometimes at attention. But when it comes to and facial features, but our bone structure, everything internal is essentially the same, right? Minus the uterus and all that stuff. So it's just something to keep in mind. Don't use this as a point of emphasis when you're trying to go in your debates, and you're just gonna, especially if you're one of those that are always trying to say, hey, women are inferior. This is not what this conversation is about, and I really encourage you not to make it so.
was very, very reliably and a very powerful effect, what you would see in their large sample size of
By the way, why is this guy gatekeeping the name of the neurotransmitter anyway? Like, just tell us. What are they paying you for, man?
transsexuals' brains postmortem was people would have this part of the brain the size not of their sex that they were born with, but rather of the sex they insisted they always actually were.
Okay, that wasn't very clear. Basically, the region of this brain where there is a considerable size difference between males and females, they found that transsexual males will have the female size of this specific area in their brain of a woman, which is why they feel like they want to be a woman. Conversely, for the female brain, the typical size of the woman is going to be a man's, and this is why they want to transition to becoming a man. And that's what the results of the studies are. Really wish they were linked, so I can read up on it, and by read on it, I just mean reading the conclusion.
Wow. Immediate questions one must ask. Okay, well, maybe this is due to the fact that when people change gender, transsexual procedures, there's a whole lot of hormones involved, and maybe that's doing something to this part of the brain. Critical control that they had was.
By the way, I'm sorry about the quality, but this is a video from 12 years ago, so deal with it.
This was looking both at transsexuals who had made gender changes and those who went to their deathbed saying, this is not the sex that I am, I got the wrong body, but never made the change. It wasn't a function of having actually gone through the transition and the endocrine manipulations with it.
This is very interesting. So basically, what he's saying, because a lot of people would argue, well, maybe there was hormonal changes that would also affect the size of this brain, right? And he's basically saying, because they had samples of people who passed away but were willingly to admit that they were always in the wrong sex, that the people who didn't transition also felt this way, and this helps solidify the evidence that perhaps it's not the hormonal the level of hormones, because when you transition you have like different levels of hormones, and you would assume that that would affect the size or the function of the region. I really don't want to repeat it. I didn't catch it, I'll be honest. But this the same region, when you think about the hormonal therapy, now they transition to people who just admitted that they thought that they were never in the right sex, but they passed away, never any transitions. So there's a very strong lack of correlation between the hormones and the imbalance of hormones and the function of this organ and how this affects transsexuality.
Another control they had, which was looking at men who would get a certain type of testicular cancer where they would have to be treated with certain feminizing hormones. In other words, very similar to some of the endocrine treatments of male to female transgendered individuals.
If it's not clear, basically when you have to get your balls removed, you have to undergo hormonal treatment because your balls are very important for the hormonal balance that you have. It does generate its own level of hormones, and he's saying how a lot of the specifically with men, but a lot of the female hormones, they had to be injected with it as well, and also for control. Because I believe he's about to say that there wasn't a strong correlation or no correlation at all.
And post-mortem, you didn't see the changes there. It has nothing to do with the hormones. It had to do with the person insisting from day one that they got the wrong body. And this was
So post-mortem, if you're not familiar with the term, basically means after they died, they check the levels of the hormones and stuff like that.
a landmark study, fabulously well done and controlled, and replicated once since then, showing that what transsexualism used to be thought of.
Very important. The ability to replicate a study is very important in the academic sector. A lot of scientific fraud has been committed recently, and there's been a lot of situations that, especially in Stanford, I think Yale had and there's a lot. The field of psychology is rife with fake data and adjusted data, and it's just false information. That's really what it is. And when you say you can replicate a study, it means that there's more validity to it because it's not just consistent in here; it's consistent in here as well. That was a lot. That was the issue with a lot of studies, especially in the field of psychology. It was very, very hard to replicate. And when you can't replicate everything using the same, sort of the same sample and the same variables and the same controls, then you really have to question the initial study and how objective it is with the answer that you're seeking.
Is that people who think that they're a different gender than they actually are. What this study suggests is what transsexualism is about is people who got the wrong gendered body. And these are people who are chromosomally of one sex. In terms of their gonads, they're of that sex. In terms of their hormones, they're of that sex. In terms of their genitalia and their secondary sexual characteristics, they're of that sex. But they're insisting that's not who I really am. This part of the brain agrees with them.
So basically what he's saying, with all the controls that have been found, including hormonal, genitalia, lack of genitalia, they looked at people who transition, people who did not transition. They looked at all of that, and one thing that's been very consistent is that this region of the brain, when post-mortem or when they analyze it, it seems that this region is very, very consistent with the idea of transsexuality. That you might feel like you might be a woman, but you feel like a man because this specific organ is like the man's version of the organ. If you wonder why this is because sometimes process like creating humans, it's not perfect. I mean, you have a lot of heterosexual people out there, right? But you still have gay people and lesbians, and even though there seems to be a predominant faction, doesn't mean that these others don't exist, and that's something that's true here. Um, just oh, what the hell is my point? Anyways, I don't really know what my point is, but this is basically the end of the video. It, what the hell is my point with that? Oh, uh, I'm not sure what I was trying to go with that, but basically, when you have something a pattern that's just very this consistent, you tend to have like a really good answer. It's possible. Oh, sorry, body processes. So technically speaking, biologically speaking, because we are meant to reproduce, you want to be heterosexual. However, that's not the case. You have like your outliers, and the outliers are significant in the population that they shouldn't be ignored. That's sort of the same way. Like if you think about the body, right? Just because the body is always going to be the same, made the same way, doesn't mean it's perfect. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, actually, right? So you have chromosomal defects. You can have people born with Huntington's disease. You can have people born with Down syndrome, which is very chromosomal. But then you can also have people who are developing well, but then because the woman for whatever reason is living in an abusive situation, drinking a lot of alcohol, exposed to a lot of poison, you can have a lot of deformity with the baby when they're born, and not and that's even considering the fact that babies can have autism, they can have very obvious defects, and creating a human baby, it's always a miracle because so many things can go wrong, right? I don't want to call this wrong. This is not wrong. It's just biologically speaking, right? The process is there, so it's possible even chromosomally. Your for example, XX, your brain just happened to develop the male version because the human cells has the ability to do that. It just happened to quote unquote, I don't want to call it like get it wrong. I don't want to call it that, but it just didn't match the chromosomes that you're paired with. So that's just something to consider. It's sort of explains everything, but I don't know if this information, like what do you want transsexual people to do? Do you want to go inside that brain and just like reduce the amount, and then you go back to being female, or you want to like grow the amount? I don't know how this is gonna help in terms of treatment, but I think that when you have something this very scientifically like there's very strong scientific evidence of this, I think it's a way we can move forward. A lot of people who feel like they have a transition, they can just never if that's what they feel is normal, I think that they should have to go through that. Now you can have a lot of religious factions, or a lot of people more in the conservative, and then just feel like, well, you're born with this body, like what's wrong with it? And honestly, there isn't. There's nothing wrong with their body. There's something wrong with them. This is something to keep in mind, right? These people are not unhappy with their body because, man, the body, I don't want to phrase it like that. The body is made in a certain way and very likely is made correctly. However, there's just this one mistake. Fuck. I don't want to call it that. It's in the end of the day, you're human, right? Even if it got it wrong in a certain region, quote unquote, got it wrong, doesn't mean that you're any less human and your feelings are any less valid, right? So that's just something to keep in mind. Now that we know that there's a scientific and a very objective way that this happens, and we know that it's very hard to control, it's kind of like it kind of sucks to tell people, hey, hide yourself, like just resist, because there's a reason why crime exists. We all know stealing is wrong, but the people who have the urge to steal can't help it. They're just gonna steal, right? That's why crime exists. I don't know. I don't know. The takeaway from here is I think that this is very helpful in allowing empathy for a lot of people who are suffering through this, because I did not know that there was an organ that was associated with this issue, and it's in the end of the day, we have to remember that they're living, breathing humans. They have this one difference, a very big difference, but we shouldn't think any less of them, and we should just if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. There's nothing we can do about it, right? And asking them to suppress it while valiant in many ways or virtuous in many ways, it's just not realistic because we're human. It's going to be a struggle every day, and people with addiction will tell you, it's so easy to relapse. Uh, you just can't help it because yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, right? Regardless of political leanings, in the end of the day, we're all human, and we're just trying to live our lives. So that's always something to consider. That's something I live by. Anyways, thank you very much. Later days.